Chairman Xi Jinping's cult of personality has become so tight that he's centralized power to himself far more than the emperors of old or even Mao Zedong. And when you do this, a number of things come from it. So for example, the power outages that happened in China back in May, it's entirely possible, highly likely, that Xi wasn't even informed about them until September, because he has literally shot the messenger so many times that nobody wants to bring him bad news. We didn't get a real policy to deal with that until last month. So we've been having rolling blackouts. It just gives you an idea of the information vacuum that Xi Jinping is operating under. We also have some fairly credible reports, in my opinion, that indicate that Xi didn't know that the war was going to happen at all until he read it in the paper the next day. His own intelligence folks had no idea, or they were unwilling to bring him a reasonable presentation of what was going on in Eurasia. And so he just went with his conversation with Putin, the first conversation he had had with a foreign leader, face-to-face in over 2 years, and that was the end of it. The Chinese vaccine doesn't work. It probably is only about 10 to 15% effective versus death against the Omicron variant. So we know that the Chinese system is in a degree of lockdown. We know that the zero tolerance policy for COVID is going to continue because they dare not let it up. Well, they're also facing a demographic collapse, trade challenges, and let's say an Olympic process that with the Paralympics are not exactly going very well from a PR point of view. I know it's all been Russia, Russia, Ukraine, Ukraine for the West, but in the rest of the world, they're looking a lot more at the propaganda that the Chinese are putting out, and it's taking on a desperate hinge. So if you're Xi or the Communist Party and you know that economics and demographics and security are turning against you, you've got to find another pillar of support, and that is not health, because the vaccine doesn't work. Food security. Unfortunately, 2 to 3 years ago, the Chinese suffered from a big outbreak of African swine fever, and over the course of those 2 years, they culled over 2/3 of their herd. They culled more heads of hog than the rest of the world has in commercial farms. Since then, they've tried to rebuild it, providing grants and subsidies to anyone who can go out and start a hog herd. So we got 2 million people who entered the business of raising hogs who had never done anything in agriculture ever before. Phytosanitary operations are practically non-existent, and I would be shocked if the Chinese are not already experiencing a second round of African swine fever. So if you're Xi and food security is one of the few things left, then you can't count on pork. All that's left is rice. Now, China is the world's largest exporter of phosphate-type fertilizers because they have to be the world's largest producer of them, because phosphate is primarily, from the Chinese point of view, a rice fertilizer. So you can see here the chunks of the market that the Chinese are good at. The bottom two are by far the most important because those are the two primary derivations of phosphate-based fertilizer. And the Chinese have banned their exports. So even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we were already dealing with a first-order effect fertilizer shortage that was already global in scope because the single biggest player in the market stopped. I do not expect the Chinese to reinstitute fertilizer exports this year. It's entirely possible that they will never do it again because the Chinese system has so few legs left to stand on. Food security is one of the few things, and rice is the only thing that they can control themselves. And so they are. So phosphate fertilizer, very bad position. Let's talk about nitrogen. Here's oil and natural gas investment globally. Back in 2014, a narrative took place in the Wall Streets of the world that fossil fuels were dead, so why would you invest in it? Over the next 7 years, investment dropped by 60%. On average, it takes 3 to 8 years to bring a new oil and gas project online if it's conventional, assuming we have the money, which means that the price environment that we're seeing even before the Ukraine situation kicks in, that was going to last for a minimum of 3 years because of a lack of supply. Even if we all doubled our investment in a day, which is happening now, you should not expect to see significant improvements in supply before 2025. And of course, we do have the war. So here's this fun little map again. These pipelines here, they're going to stop assuming for the moment that the Europeans don't sanction them, and I'm not really expecting that, they're going to get blown up either by the Russians by misfiring a few things, or by Ukrainian partisans who start blowing up infrastructure that they perceive benefits the Russians. It's going to be very easy for them to cross over into Belarus and do the same thing. So from that, you should expect significant drawdowns in the ability of the world to access Russian outputs, specifically Russian natural gas outputs. Natural gas, of course, is what we use to make nitrogen-based fertilizer. Here's US prices at Henry Hub. You can see that even with the spikes from the Texas freeze and more recently shortages in production, that we never really breached 6 for more than a couple of days, and we're already back in the general facility, or the general range of 4 to 5. But in the United States, shale production is different from the global norm. It's closer to users, it requires less transport, it's less vulnerable to disruption, and most importantly, it doesn't take as long to bring online. If all the pieces are in place, from the time you start working on a shale well, you're talking 3 to 8 weeks until it's producing. If the prices are expensive, like are in some parts of the United States right now, it's still never going to be more than 8 months. So we have a price control situation here that the rest of the world doesn't have. And here are the prices up until the end of February for the Europeans and the Asians. Keep in mind that a lot of the natural gas that is used in Europe and the vast, vast majority of natural gas that is used in Asia is not piped. It's brought in by tanker via LNG. That's a far more expensive way to do it. And so anytime you have a disruption in the system, the price break between piped natural gas and tankered LNG is going to widen in addition to the general price elevation. We don't have finished March data. Obviously, we're only a week in, but we saw prices in Europe pipe up to $65 just 4 days ago. Right now, they're between 45 and 50. So this is not the state. This chart is not the state of affairs. This is the best we should ever expect it being in Europe and Asia, because we now can anticipate significant volumes of Russian crude and especially natural gas to fall offline and not come back. Probably half of natural gas coming out of Russia is going to fall off within the next couple of months, and all Russian LNG exports from Sakhalin and from Yamal are going to fall off before the end of the calendar year. The Europeans are turning in part to liquefied natural gas to replace the Russian piped gas, which means that the price is only going to go up more. Okay, this is starting to get a little depressing for me. When natural gas prices skyrocket like this, the people who use natural gas have to make choices. I mean, do we use it to make plastics? Do we use it to make fertilizer? Do we use it to keep the lights on? And in Europe, we're already seeing those decisions needing to be made, and they're making them. So Yara, the Norwegian fertilizer mega company, has already slowed output from all of their European locations because the price of natural gas has risen to the point that they're having to make choices between fertilizer and power, and they're choosing power. So we're at the leading edge of a massive shortage in nitrogen-based fertilizer. It started in Europe. It's going to spread to Asia very, very quickly because that price disconnect is huge in Asia because almost all of the natural gas they use is imported via LNG.